Thank you all for coming to ICOET and to the Captain Now Session 5. Kicking us off this morning is Reed Barbee of Panthera, and he's going to be talking about modeling mountain lion habitat connectivity on the Olympic Peninsula. Reed, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Reed Barbee. I'm currently a conservation analyst with the Panthera Puma program, and I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about some of the work I did as a master's student with the Puma program at the University of Montana modeling mountain lion habitat connectivity on the Olympic Peninsula. Uh-oh. I'd like to start by acknowledging that all of this work was done with the partnership of the Quinault, Lower Elwha, Clallam, Skokomish, Port Gamble, and Jamestown Squamish tribes and the Makah Indian Nation, who have been instrumental partners throughout the whole process and every step from data collection through analysis through write-up. And of course, we're here at a conference on ecology and transportation, and I'm going to kick us right off with a talk about linear infrastructure and connectivity modeling. I probably don't need to show you this, but there is a strong relationship between geographic range size, habitat fragmentation, and species endangered status. This is IUCN status of mammals, and you can see the red crosses are largely clustered in areas of higher fragmentation and smaller range size. So what do we do about this? Well, one popular option, of course, is to implement crossing structures, either bridges or culverts or otherwise. This is, of course, the Snoqualmie Pass crossing as an example. And but once we decide to build these structures, how do we decide where to put them? There are many methods, of course, but one is connectivity modeling, in which there are many flavors, and I'm just going to outline a few of them for you today. But before I do that, I think it's helpful to agree on what is connectivity when I'm talking about connectivity. I think Farag et al. In 2021 gave a good definition as the ability of individuals to successfully move across landscapes to maintain population viability or population performance. This entails both a movement and a reproduction component of connectivity. In practice, the reproduction piece can be somewhat difficult to obtain unless you have genetic data or direct observation. I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the movement component. So how do we measure connectivity? These are a few popular methods: GPS locations, cameras, genetic samples, and expert opinion. I'm going to touch on all four, but mainly I'm focused on GPS locations and camera detections and comparing methods using these two data sources. The GPS locations are often considered a gold standard because of their finer spatial and temporal resolution. They actually follow the animals around for their paths, but of course they're more expensive and more invasive to implement. So if we can achieve the same objectives using cameras, which are cheaper and easier to implement, that's a plus. So this begs the question, which was one of the main questions of my master's work: can camera-based occupancy models be used effectively in place of GPS-based habitat selection models to plan corridors where collaring animals is unfeasible? This question has already been addressed somewhat by Sarah Bassing at the University of Washington in 2022. They did a multi-carnivore study comparing resource selection functions from cameras and GPS collars, and they found for some species in some seasons, like bobcats, the data sources agreed fairly well. You see those distribution maps are pretty similar, but for other species like coyotes, not so much. So this leaves room for further exploration of this question, I believe. Some reasons for this discrepancy: of course, the data are collected in quite different ways. The collars follow the animals around, where the cameras tend to be placed in grids, and you're comparing more structural aspects of the landscape. One is more of a movement-based connectivity, and one is more structural. So I did all of this work with the Olympic Cougar Project, which is a collaboration of Panthera, the Makah Indian Nation, the Lower Elwha Clallam Tribe, the Jamestown and Port Gamble Squamish tribes, Quinault Indian Nation, Skokomish Indian Tribe, and of course the Washington Department of Transportation, as well as University of Montana. Oh, and a major focus of this project is connectivity across the I-5 corridor between Seattle and Portland. Just to give you an idea of where we're at, this is the United States. We're way up in the northwest corner on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State. And this is just a flyover showing you what the landscape looks like. It's a nice mosaic of forest, rainforest, river valleys, mountains, coastline, quite a bit of logging activity. Not extremely densely populated by humans, but still plenty of human disturbance. Nice varied landscape that our animals are living in. So why are mountain lions a good species to address this comparison question? Well, they're mobile and quite wide-ranging. They're sensitive to fragmentation. They overlap in range and pathways with many other species, and particularly in this area, they're facing potential threats. For this talk, the threat I'm going to be focusing on primarily is the I-5 highway. This is a picture of it just outside of Olympia near rush hour traffic. You can see lots of lanes, lots of cars, a substantial barrier. And there's been some data, some studies to suggest that it is in fact a barrier. This is a genetic analysis by Warren et al. In 2016 that found 4 distinct mountain lion populations within Washington state, of which the yellow circles there, the Olympic population, was the most genetically isolated. And then in 2022, Zeller et al. Did a genetic connectivity study across Washington state. And while there are some differences between males and females in connectivity across the board, we see that dark line there around I-5, right on the edge of the peninsula here, suggesting that it is indeed a barrier. And then finally, there's an expert-based model developed by the Washington Habitat Connectivity Working Group that also identifies that corridor as a major barrier. And just one last illustration of this. This is a animation with GPS collar data from one of our young dispersing males on the project. He starts up on the southern end of the peninsula there, works his way down towards Olympia, gets stuck there a little bit, actually makes it successfully across the highway there, but finds himself in a trailer park, gets scared, goes back across, and then begins to go further south. But you'll see he then bounces off the Columbia River, bounces off I-5 again, and more or less gets stuck in this area. So made several attempts to try to get across, but wasn't able to. So in addition to this more general question comparing the methods from cameras and the GPS collars, we want to know where mountain lions most likely to cross the I-5 highway corridor. And in part, we want to know this to help inform the Washington statewide connectivity action plan. So I used 2 methods here, one with GPS data and one with camera data. The first one with the GPS data is called step selection analysis or step selection simulation. If you're not familiar with this, basically you have a collar on an animal and you follow it over a landscape across time, and you can measure the distance between each location as well as the angle that the animal turned. And using those step length and turn angle distributions, you can generate a set of locations that the animal could have used for every location that they did use, and compare landscape characteristics at the locations they used versus the ones they didn't use, and get an idea of what kinds of landscape features they're attracted to versus repelled by. The basic workflow that I followed, you start with the data, you fit your step selection model, you can take those coefficients and then project them to the landscape as a probability of use surface. And then using those step length and turn angle distributions, you can simulate animals moving across that probability of use matrix. If you do that a bunch of times, you can count how many times each cell on the landscape was used by the animal and get sort of a step density surface that works like a connectivity map. The data for training, I used 82 individuals, pretty evenly distributed across resident dispersal classes and sexes, and validation 103, mainly that didn't have enough data to train the model or that were sampled in such a way that they didn't quite fit the model framework. Pretty standard set of covariates, gross primary productivity, NDVI, slope, aspect, human population density. Happy to talk about these more in detail later. And then this is just to give you an idea of the general population level coefficients that came out from the top model for the GPS collars. Lots of variation in response to elevation, but things that I think are notable here are a positive response to net primary productivity, negative responses to road density and human population density, and an intermediate response to tree cover. Interestingly, if we break these out by demographic category, it seemed, at least in this sample, there was a lot more variation within demographic categories than between them. There was a lot of variation generally, but it didn't seem, at least in this sample, like different dispersal classes or different sexes were behaving all of that differently in response to the landscape features. We take those coefficients and project them to the landscape. The map looks something like this, and already we're seeing that highway corridor pop up as a barrier again. I then used the model to simulate 200,000 animals moving across that matrix for 1 year with the population level movement and selection parameters. And then if you just count the number of times that each cell was used, you end up with a map kind of like this. If we then bend those counts into 10 quantiles, we get more discrete classes, and the contrast pops out a little bit better. So this is the final product from that model. I then took all of those locations that I didn't use to build the model and overlaid them on the surface and found out which bin they fell into, and it validated pretty well with a correlation of 0.9 and 21.9% of locations falling in the top bin. It also validated pretty well across the 4 demographic categories with correlations between 0.9 and 0.93. Now, if we talk about the camera version, this was done in an occupancy framework, which if you're not familiar with, just very quickly, you divide the landscape into a grid. Each grid cell has a latent state of either being occupied or unoccupied. You sample the cells with cameras, and then you have a detection history for each cell, whether you detect or do not detect the species of interest. And you can use that to model, in this case, a relative probability of use across the landscape, not a true occupancy, since the closure assumption is violated. It's a similar workflow. Start with the camera data, fit the model, project the coefficients to the landscape. Then we create a resistance surface, and there are multiple ways to do this, but in this case, just took 1 minus the probability of use surface to translate to resistance, and then run through CircuitScape to create a current density surface. And CircuitScape just takes that resistance surface and treats it as a network of nodes and resistors, where the strength of the resistance corresponds to the value of the cell. And you simulate an electrical current running through that entire matrix, and then you can get a current density surface. I used camera data from our Olympic Cougar project, as well as some contributed from the Olympic National Park Fisher Restoration Program to fill in the gaps, and ended up with 1,210 unique stations across the entire peninsula and 8 years. Coefficients, of course, the number of days that a camera was active was the strongest effect on whether or not the species was detected. I kept study in there, even though it wasn't completely significant, to address the large differences in design between the 2 studies. And then again, we see negative impacts of human impact, road density, slightly negative non-vegetated area, and a positive impact of EVI, or Enhanced Vegetation Index. If we project those coefficients to the landscape again, just like we did with the collars, this is the surface that we get. And if we convert that to resistance, this is just 1 minus that surface. And then Puget Sound and some of the other estuaries and inland bodies, water bodies, blocked out as high resistance also. And place nodes around a 20% buffer around that area and use CircuitScape to run electrical current through that. And this is what the cumulative current density surface looks like from that. This is not the raw output. It's also bent into 10 quantiles. Again, we see the I-5 highway as a pretty large barrier. if we compare them, they are different for sure, especially around the mountains. And I think because of the way that the nodes were positioned and the fact that it's less disturbed up in the northwest corner of the peninsula there, that really lights up in the circuitscape model. But they do seem to agree quite well around areas of higher human disturbance. This is just a pixel-wise correlation between the two maps if you overlay them on each other. And we see that especially around the I-5 highway corridor and areas of higher disturbance, there's pretty good agreement. Yes, so they both validated pretty well. Again, we have a high percentage of points in the higher categories. But when you break them apart into demographic groups, the GPS-based model did a lot better than the camera-based one, with good correlation across the board, whereas the camera-based one seemed to be more biased towards more common demographic classes. It did the worst for the female dispersers, which was the least common class. Just very quickly, I know I'm running a little bit out of time. This is those two maps zoomed in with I-5 in red. 3 corridors from the Washington expert-based connectivity model there, and then our 2 actual mountain lion crossings in neon. And you can see they line up pretty well, mostly with this northern crossing up here. We bring in the expert-based model. I won't go into detail about that right now, but I just wanted to show you how the 3 of them validated with the different sets of GPS data. The GPS one did the best. The camera-based one still did pretty well with a high percentage of locations in the top bin. And the expert one did not do so well, at least with this validation set. So in conclusion, I think both of these types of models are useful. They agreed not perfectly across the whole landscape, but very well in areas of high human disturbance, which is often where we're focusing when we're planning corridors. Overall, the GPS-based models outperformed the camera-based ones for dispersal behavior, especially for female dispersers. The camera-based models were more biased towards the more frequently sampled demographic classes. But I think that the camera-based models can offer a good compromise between expense and predictive power, especially when demographic differences are small and we're just focused on planning corridors in these high disturbance areas. So yes, this information has all been contributed to the statewide connectivity action plan. And just want to leave you with the idea that with this many threatened species in a large area, we can't collar everything. And it would be quite invasive and expensive to do so. So I think it's good to keep using the cameras where we can. And thanks for everyone who contributed, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks for questions. And Reed, if you could repeat the question.
Kind of a two-parter. Sorry, how many years did you have cameras out?
So the question was, how many years did we have cameras out? It was 4 years from the Olympic National Park study, and then a bit of a gap, and then it was 4 more years of camera data that I was using from the Olympic Cougar project. And it was a bit staggered in the deployment of the grid. So the map you saw was over the entire period.
Did you look at anything not using all 8 years, like different versions and how they compare to model-wise?
I did not subset it out. No. Yeah. It's a random placement, random systematic across the grid. Yeah. Perhaps. I mean, we set up the grid to be monitoring multiple species at once. So we were using the data where we could get it.
Question. Reed, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.